Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the 10th chapter of Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians. We're going to make it all the way up into the 13th verse. In the section we're going to cover today, Paul reviews historical lessons from the Jewish people that he wants translated into the Christian life. But before we expound and elaborate on Paul's review, we just want to review what took place in the antecedent chapter, the 9th one. Paul's apostolic authority was contested by some at Corinth, and this is, he dealt it, and he asserted the rights that he himself forsook to make his case that he was fully worthy of the apostolic rank, who serves as a soldier at his own expense. Paul did, verse 7. Who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit, or who does shepherd a flock and does not feed on the milk of the flock? So what Paul is, he's transitioning from Paul to everyone else at this point. So Paul does endorse the financial compensation of preachers and proclaimers of the good news. Even though he did it for nothing, all of us who are called to do it are not bound by the same Spartan standard. And he asks a question in verse 11, if we have sown spiritually among you, is it too much if we reap material from you? So the exchange and the commerce that exists between the minister and the flock is they spread spiritual blessings, which cannot be measured monetarily. In exchange, they have the right to reap monetarily. Paul forsook that right. He did not want anything to compromise his wholehearted integrity to his profession and proclamation. And then verse 14 connects with that. So also the master instituted that those announcing the good news should live from the good news. So he's appealing to the authority of the master himself, that Joshua Messiah, the Savior, the Son, and all, etc. And it's okay to live from the good news. That is your life source as you go, even if you're doing it for nothing. I haven't been paid a red cent for doing everything that I do. I still do it, though. Not to compare, my journey with Paul's. His had shipwreck, 39 lashes, and all this stuff. My life is pretty boring compared to Paul's, let's just put it that way. But I have used none of these, nor have I written this, that it should be done so for me. For it would be better for me to die than anyone should make my boasting empty. So Paul, once more, after asserting the right of everyone else, he announces that he renounces this right in himself. He is a spiritual Spartan man who accepted no pay, endured all the trials and tribulations and temptations, and he had Satan actively aligned against him in a lot of places, but it was all worth it for him, and his investment really has a historical echo. How many generations and people have been blessed just from reading the pen of Paul, who penned some half of the New Testament. But he really regards it as a life and death issue, and he is willing to lay down his life than make his boasting empty. So he considered his boasting empty if he did it all for show, or did it all for money, or did it all for Paul. He was doing it for the cause of the good news, and that alone. And the good news is central to his thinking. And in the spread of the good news, Paul adapted different evangelical personas for different audiences. And to the Jew I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under Torah, as under Torah, so as to win those who are under Torah. To those without Torah, as without Torah, not being without Torah towards Elohim, but under Torah of Messiah, so as to win those who are without Torah. So the Torah is the Pentateuch, it is the law of Moses, it is the governing guidelines which dictate the Jewish religion, the Jewish people's daily lives, but we Christians are differently related to it. That conversation could go any number of ways. I don't want to distract from the more constructive flow of this, but he became a Gentile to the Gentiles. He tolerated certain things from them. He didn't insist. He was at the Apostolic Assembly in Jerusalem Council, where it was decreed absolutely by a not unanimous apostolic consent that circumcision would pose no barrier to the Gentiles becoming Christians. To the weak I became as weak, so as to win the weak. To all I have become all, so as to save some by all means. So he speaks extensively on spiritual strength and spiritual weakness in the 14th chapter of the book of Romans. I did one on that. You can type that in now if you're curious. But he knows that he's going to save some. He's going to cast the widest possible net, but he knows that only a remnant will be saved, and he endures the rejection and persecution of the ones who reject him and his message. But, he was willing to go the extra mile to win that one convert, and as many, he was, one of a kind. And I do this because of the good news, so as to become a fellow partaker with it. So his motivation and incentive for serving and spreading the good news was the good news itself. It is the causational effect of being blessed, is to spread the blessing we have received. Anyone who's lived to tell the tale that Paul has lived, or even I have lived, and or I'm sure every other Christian, every authentic one has lived. Anyone who lives to tell that tale lives to tell that tale. Do you not know that all those who run in a race indeed all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way as to obtain it. So the path to salvation is straight and narrow, and only a remnant shall be saved. So he's trying to get his audience's mind wired into the race, the run, the marathon of salvation. And the Christian life is it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. It's an element of endurance. It is longer than a marathon. It's the 365-day a year, 24/7, all day, every day, till death do us part and beyond. Run in such a way like that. Do you not know that those who run in a race and it's all for the incorruptible crown? So the athletes on earth would compete for a carnal, physical, incorruptible crown, one that would rust and corrode. But he's speaking of an incorruptible crown, the seal of salvation. And that's enough from that. We're going to turn to the actual lesson itself, first verse, 10th chapter. 1 Corinthians, for I do not want you to be ignorant, brothers, that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea. So the two terms we hear are brothers and fathers, and the brothers are the Christians and the fathers are the Jews, and he doesn't want the Christians to be ignorant of their Jewish heritage, even though not every one of them, the majority of the assembly at Corinth, were of Gentile stock. They were not physically or biologically descended from the Jews, but they are their spiritual forebears. So the Jews are as Christians. The New Testament is not obsolete. I feel the New Testament is often exercised at the expense, but I try and maintain the balance. But the cloud we do read in the Old Testament, much of this links with the Old Testament. That's why it's really foundational to know the Old Testament in order to understand the New, because the New quotes the Old can't quote the New. So it's in that sense, it's more foundational. But the cloud, that was the presence and guidance and manifestation of the form of divinity guiding the Exodus nation of Israel in the form of a cloud, and all passed through the sea from the same force, the same entity, the same being who was working wonders on their behalf. After inflicting Egypt with 10 plagues, the Pharaoh finally relents and lets the people go, thus answering Moses' repeated petition that it took 10 plagues. It was the death of the firstborn, which visited Pharaoh's own home. That then Pharaoh was a hard-hearted and stubborn man, we read repeatedly, and he gathers the chariots to chase them down there at the Red Sea when they catch up. And the Red Sea literally parts in time for the Israelite nation, the soon-to-be Israelite nation, 40 years away, actually, because they prolonged the date that they could come to the Promised Land, and none who walked through lived in Egypt, save Joshua and Caleb lived into the Promised Land. But the problem is they had squandered the unprecedented witness of the miracle in spite of all that he had done for them, and had swallowed the Egyptian chariots whole. So Pharaoh lost a whole army, and the Israelites left with much of the wealth of Egypt in their pockets. And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. So the baptism is likened to the Jewish identification. We are baptized into the Messiah as Christians. So Jews would have, been baptized in the sense that Moses was their spiritual standard and the end-all, be-all of their religion. And this took place in the clouds and in the sea, and the sea was the Red Sea, the one they had passed through. So the baptism came down, the dunking and the submersion and the literal death came down on the Egyptians. That's why I tried to interpret it the way I just did, rather than the way I just hopefully implicitly communicated would not. And all ate the same spiritual food. Now, the food that they ate was manna. That was their physical. This was another manifestation of a miracle. They were in the dry desert. Desert is an inhabitable, lifeless death swamp of just vast swaths of existence, very little life, nothing to really sustain yourself on. So they all had the manna from heaven, which came down on their behalf. This enabled them to eat and have the nutrition and sustenance to endure the 40-year trek that they ultimately imposed on themselves for mismanaging the challenges of freedom. Even after all he had done for them, they strangely longed for the security of bondage. But the spiritual food, this makes more sense if we read the fourth verse. And all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed, and the rock was Messiah. So physical food is spiritual food. He often tells them in Deuteronomy 8:3, thou shalt not live by bread alone, and manna was bread from the heaven, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of Yahweh. So we receive spiritual food and spiritual drink and spiritual sustenance from abiding and basking and fellowshipping and just having communion with him. The Christian life is not a religion, it is a relationship with a higher power who is above and beyond us, yet working miracles in our lives every day. We're just aware of the fact, and the Israelite generation was not aware of the fact. They had no notion that the future Redeemer who would come into the earth and pay the ransom, the one who Moses alluded to in Deuteronomy 18, about the prophet that was to come. Listen to him, all ye that obey. And tragically, the Jews of that generation were not much better off than those of the Exodus generation, in that they rejected and killed the Messiah who had led their ancestors. Without his working, they wouldn't even be there, because they wouldn't be a nation if they didn't make it out of the desert by the physical food and the spiritual food that he provided. And wherever he goes, he brings his spiritual treasures as nuggets which can fall from the heaven into our lives. However, with most of them Elohim was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. So this translates into something we referenced in the earlier chapter. Only one shall win the race. So there is a remnant, there is a righteous remnant, and it's a small minority of those who find the straight and narrow, who walk the straight and narrow and find the path to salvation, and only a remnant shall be saved of Israel. I believe Isaiah and also Paul himself wrote, shall be saved. And with most of them, they were liberated slaves, physical slaves, entrenched in the Egyptian economy as such for some 400 to 430 years, depending on one's measurement. We don't have time to get into that. But from being redeemed in slavery, now they were rebelled. They became slaves, then they became rebels. They rebelled against their heavenly master who was guiding them and liberating them and redeeming them for a purpose beyond their reckoning. They were so distracted by their carnal appetites that they neglected the spiritual purpose of their mission. So at one point they murmured. Murmuring is a frequent word throughout the early Pentateuch. The Pentateuch. It is the source of many rebellions, and they were specifically murmuring, I believe, in Exodus 16 or somewhere thereabouts, that they had all the dietary luxuries that they had as slaves in Egypt, and they were complaining about the manna in the heaven, because as slaves in Egypt, they had the locks and everything, every other even as slaves. So, you can take the slave out of the plantation, but sometimes you can't take the plantation out of the slave. And these became examples for us, so that we should not lust after evil, as those indeed lusted. So they survive, even though they were unfortunate, perhaps salvifically speaking, and in life they cursed themselves to wander in a desert where they had nothing but manna to eat and no homes to call their own. They were a mobile people as wanderers, going in a circle the size of New Jersey for 40 years, all over the place, and their suffering should survive as an example for us not to follow, not to lust after evil, because once they were redeemed, they immediately were oriented towards evil. They wanted more. They weren't content with the manna falling from the heaven. They wanted latkes and fish and everything else. And as they can lust, so too can we. Our world is evil. Evil is literally all around us in all places at all times, but it is only potent when we lust after it. So when you become a Christian, you cannot look at sin in the same way, and your appetite for lusting after evil, it still rears its ugly, pathetic head from time to time again, every part of the Christian, even in the Christian's life, but it no longer controls you or enslaves you or dominates you as the Egyptians did the Jews. And and do not become idolaters, as some of them were, as it had been written, the people sat down to eat and to drink and stood up to play. So idolatry would have meant different things to Jews and Gentiles. The Gentiles were familiar and accustomed and cultured and groomed and born into religious practices where idols were worshipped. There were many gods. The idolatry is closely connected to a polytheism. So for each god, they were represented in an earthly statue. And that's what happened when Moses went away for 40 days. In Numbers 25 through 32, we read of this blissful, or 31 rather, we read of this blissful interlude where Moses is receiving a revelation of splendor and magnificence pertaining to the temple, or the tabernacle that he was, everything was laid out, then connected, and then we get to the 32 chapter, the Jewish people, Hebrew people, were so impatient with that 40-day stigma that they had succumbed to idolatry, and Aaron, who was the designated enforcer of religion, as the high priest, caved in to peer pressure and the mob mentality. He followed a multitude to do unto evil, as we are warned in not to do in 23:2 of the same book of Exodus. But they also, succumbed to idolatry when they allowed Baal to exert his influence to get them to sleep with the Moabite women who were virgin prostitutes at their temples. And so that defiled them also on the road to the Exodus. But it could also defile the Corinthians, and it can defile us. The Corinthians had literal idols. The idols in our day are slightly more sophisticated. Now, I just want to elaborate on this concept as concisely as I can. The distinction and the difference between a god and an idol is a god is any source of supreme satisfaction that you seek. That is your personal god, and the idol is the physical edifice through which it is worship. So television has idolatrous potential. The internet technology, it can be used for good, what we're doing here, but it can also be used for evil. And it is the most potent and subtle form of idolatry in our day, the technological devices. But you just have to exercise your discernment to know when it becomes an idol. And if you're obsessing over it, that means, If you're addicted to your phone or television or anything else, maybe take away, be still, and know that I am. Psalm 46:10. Neither should we commit whoring, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. So as a consequence of Baal, first off, Baal of Beor was a Mesopotamian soothsayer summoned by Balak, the king of the Moabites, when Israel was passing through as a nation. They hired this man from some 500 miles away to come and issue a curse, but Yahweh intervenes through his donkey and through his angel and gives him a message, and Balaam is powerless to resist the message as it has been given to him, so he cannot do what the king paid him to do, which was to pronounce and issue a curse. There was an irresistible force, but once that Balaam remained unconverted from his encounter, because in the 32nd chapter of Numbers, or somewhere between 25 and that 32 or whatever, we read that he seduced, at his persuasion, Israel allowed themselves to be seduced sexually by the Moabite temple prostitutes. They were virgins, and sex was a big part of pagan and polytheism. There were fertility cults. There was a goddess of fertility that gave the rocks, and gods of fertility. They were the ones who were imagined to give the rain to the ground, and also the sexual sensation in humans. So sex was a big part of idolatrous religion and practice. And according to the Old Testament account, it's 24,000, but Paul records it for 23,000. Paul wasn't concerned for exactness the way most moderns are. Neither let us try Messiah, as some of them also tried, and were destroyed by serpents. So again, they weren't aware that when you step on Yahweh's toes, you are stepping on Yahshua's and also the Ruach Kadesh's, because they are one being in certain senses. We don't have time to elaborate much on that. So the same spiritual rock through whom they received their sustenance and food and drink throughout the journey was also the one they were tempting, and and they tempted Yahweh more explicitly and directly, but they were sent a punishment of serpents, and they bit these venomous serpents, and serpents are connected with Satan in Hebrew, but the less, and in that story we read that Aaron's staff became a wooden cobra that the Israelites could look on were they bitten by this snake and be saved, and that survived. It survived, but it eventually became an idol, and it wasn't until the great reformer Hezekiah that it was eliminated as such. But neither grumble, as some of them also grumbled, and were destroyed by the destroyer. So the serpent is the destroyer. The serpent is Satan. He is the one who got into their heads and filled their hearts and minds away from God and away from Yahweh and towards themselves and sin and wickedness. So the Exodus experience is one collectively a giant moral failing, and that's one of the reasons that only Jacob and Joshua and Caleb were allowed to live, because on the reason it was 40 years to begin with is because they took a 38-day expedition to scout and investigate the Promised Land, and there was 12 from each of the tribes, and there were literal giants in the land they came to investigate, and they gave the counsel of fear, where Joshua and Caleb alone gave the counsel of faith. They were walking by faith, these other scouts who swayed the majority of the Israelites to not go in there just yet. And that's why they spent, because it was 38 days, it was at the 2-year point, so it was a year for every day. That failing had serious consequences. They had been walking in the power and in the presence of Yahweh, the omnipotent one, and they were afraid of literal giants. So that's why, but they were ultimately destroyed by the destroyer. Now, one of the things we got to clarify, because remember, we're trying to make it all the way up to the 13th verse, is that God does not tempt or destroy anyone. That is the adversary in the division of labor between good and evil. But the adversary is under his sovereign control. So whenever a temptation comes our way, that is him testing us. But the devil is tempting us at the same time. We'll get into that more. And all these came upon them as examples, and they were written as a warning to us, of whom the ends of the ages have come. So once more, he uses the example. We read that word in the 6th verse. These became examples for us, and that the example that they were written, they were recorded in parchment and ink to warn future generations not to follow their hearts towards evil lust and follow the path that is directed by the serpent and the destroyer, and be bit by the serpent and destroyed by the destroyer. So that he who thinks he stands, let him take heed lest he fall. So when there are valleys and there are mountains in the Christian life, and sometimes we're on the mountain, and that's when we get weak. That's when I got to watch out, because things can't stay this good forever, at least not in this mortal frame, this life that we have on earth. Whenever a lot of people, they follow God until he fails to reward them, they think that he is the one rewarding them for their righteousness. But spiritual strength is ultimately an illusion, because our source of strength comes exclusively and only and totally from the omnipotent one, and not in ourselves. So when we have that self-conceit, that self-exaltation, we will be humbled, we will fall to hell, ultimately. No trial has ever overtaken you except such as is common to man, and Elohim is trustworthy, who shall not allow you to be tried beyond what you are able, but that the temptation shall also make way the escape, enabling you to bear it. So once the thing that's communicated start to finish in this passage is Elohim's sovereign control. He's allowing the temptations to come our way. These are not to harm us, but to better us and to enable us to grow and progress unto him and become more like him. And he sent his own son, who was tempted in weak, vulnerable moments. So there's spiritual highs and there are spiritual lows. And when we are at the depths of despair, that is an equally dangerous extremity, because the Savior was fasted for 40 days, and the subtle serpent crawled in and gave him the nefarious suggestions. He had recently been baptized, and the blessing that he had received from his baptism was, thou art my only begotten, my beloved, in whom I am well pleased. And then some 6 weeks later, the serpent slithered in and sowed the seed of doubt. If you are the son of El, turn this rock into bread. And that's also where he quotes Deuteronomy 8:3. We referenced that once earlier. But the point is that he was there's nothing that he hasn't experienced that we haven't experienced. And when we are suffering and we tend to isolate and imagine that no one knows what I'm going through, but we actually have an advocate and a high priest and an atonement and everything else that he is, our Redeemer, our Resurrector, our ransom, who has gone through what we've gone through. And the Father he knows our limits, and he's not going to tempt us to harm us. He's not going to tempt us beyond the point of our salvation once we are sealed to it. But every temptation that comes, we got to treat them individually and in the collective. So a temptation comes literally dozens, if not hundreds of times throughout the days. There are temptations, but there is always, more importantly, a way to escape. There is a way out, and that will make the potency of the temptation eventually diminish. Because once you resist it one time and you don't indulge anymore, you get in the habit, in the practice of not indulging to begin with, and resistance becomes a lot more easier. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.